Junction, junction, what's your function? Right, that's the question that we need to ask in this video. What's the purpose of amino acids and what's the purpose of proteins? What do they actually do? Why are they important? Why do we need them? So these are the questions that we're going to answer. And I first want to start off with talking about really what kind of role do amino acids and proteins have, and you're going to see quite a different array of things that they do for you. So first we've got this set that are called structural proteins. And structural proteins are important because they provide structure. For example, collagen is the major component of bones, muscles, and tendons. Right? Keratin is in your hair, hooves of animals, feathers, fur, and the outer layers of skin. So structural features of protein are very important. So we're going to put biological here, biological structure. They provide these things strength, and they provide these things shape, and they don't move. So they're very locked into place when they are made. Another thing that we can talk about as far as proteins go are called protective proteins. And protective proteins are important because this is what really prevents maybe snakes from being attacked by predators. So these are things like venom. And inside of venom, we've got some proteins, or we can attack proteins. And this venom will start to decay the person that tries to attack that copperhead, or that tries to attack that cobra. We got blood clotting proteins. So when you cut yourself, well, we don't bleed forever, and that's the reason. That's because we've got some proteins in our system that basically go up to the site of the cut, and it just kind of helps stop the flow of blood. So we've got proteins that basically help us clot our blood so we don't bleed to death. Sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. And we also have these things called antibodies and antibiotics, and they help us, of course, from disease. So these are not necessarily proteins every single time, but the actual protein, as far as the antibody goes, is somewhat of a protein structure. So these are very important as well. When you get sick, or when you have maybe an allergy to something, it's these immunoglobulins and these proteins that really run to the front line of the cavalry and take care of everything. We then have this thing called enzymes, and enzymes are basically just catalysts. That's all that they are. So these catalysts basically speed up reactions. So proteins sometimes are there to help this reaction go fairly quickly. We want this reaction to go through in a matter of minutes or a matter of hours. We don't want to wait days and months and years for it to go on. So this is another purpose of some proteins. Proteins also make up your hormones. Yeah, if you're hormonal, and you know who you are if you are, then you can kind of blame the proteins for it, because hormones are basically a family of proteins that we can talk about. And this goes from everything from testosterone to estrogen. Some of them regulate reactions that occur in living systems, of course. So there's a multitude of different types of hormone proteins that are out there. And then finally, proteins with physiological function. Okay, so that's a nice word to write down just to test your spelling technique. Physiological. So physiological. And these are really the proteins that transport oxygen. So I can put out here transport O2. And this also can be found in maybe muscles. They can build muscle, train muscle, whatever the case is. But those are physiological proteins that are very important as well. So we get really a family of compounds here that do quite a bit of different things. And these range in the role that they're made to do. And that's one of the beauties of amino acids. You know, carbohydrates were very simplistic as far as what they were made to do, right? So we eat a carbohydrate, and the carbohydrate, if we eat too much, gets stored as glycogen, and then that gets broken down, and that is our energy reserve that we use for energy to make our metabolism go, to make us walk, to make us breathe, to make us talk, to make you listen into this lecture. However, proteins are a different story. Proteins are a little bit more complicated as far as their role goes. So we have this family of proteins that are basically giving birth to every day, and those proteins are given an assignment. They're given a job title, and they go out and they do their job that they were made to do, and then sometimes they come back and do it all over again. Other times, though, they get destroyed and they never come back. So it's kind of sad for that protein family, but that's just the way of life. So they have to deal with it. Alright, so this is kind of the idea of what a protein's purpose is. There's two different types of proteins. One is going to be called a globular protein, and the other one is going to be called a fibrous protein. And a globular protein and fibrous protein, well, you can kind of look at the words and kind of understand what that means. So globular basically means a glob, right? So just a big blob, and that's what that protein looks like. And that's going to be very important a little bit later on, but that's what we call a globular protein. We have a fibrous protein, and when I think of fiber, I kind of think of thread, right? So a fibrous protein is a protein that looks kind of like a string. So here's two maybe fibrous proteins that are near each other. So we've got this globular blobby shape, real big, fat, and nasty that comes along, and then we have this really stringy kind of protein that comes in that's very long, that's kind of like a snake that withers through whatever environment that you put it in. And these two different types of proteins, like we said before, have particular functions. And one of those differences, as you would expect, is that globular proteins are not really soluble in water. And that's just because it's so big, it's so fat. The fibrous protein can typically dissolve in water, or is typically soluble in water. And the reason for that we'll take a look at a little bit later on in the lecture, but this is one of the major differences between a globular protein and a fibrous protein. So globulars are not soluble, fibrous is soluble, and you can think of them like blobs and like thread. I'm sorry, I've actually got these backward. Globular proteins are soluble. Let me change that here. So they are soluble, and then the fibrous proteins are not soluble. So let me change that before we go any further. So these big fat globular proteins do typically dissolve in water most of the time, and these long fibrous chains of proteins typically do not dissolve in water at all. So again, we'll take a look at these structures. We'll talk about why one dissolves and why the other one doesn't, but we've got to take a look at the actual structure for the amino acid first. And in the next video, that's what we'll do. So this is where we'll stop. In the next video, we'll look at the individual amino acids. We will begin to talk about them. We'll begin to memorize, yes, memorize the structure of these amino acids, because that's very important. It's going to basically help us determine a lot of these answers to these problems, and a lot of the theory that goes on behind the protein structure, if we can understand the amino acid structure first. So with that said, stop the video, go to video number 3, don't stop here, you can keep on trucking, and we'll take a look at our first kind of group of amino acids.